Hello, and welcome to a new edition of True Audio Files. Today, I'm going to talk about Dave Brubeck Quartet's Time Out. For those of you who don't follow me on social media and on YouTube here, I'm not sure I actually had it on YouTube, but I definitely had it on my social media on my Facebook group. A couple of weeks ago, I had an amazing haul at my local record store where I actually was able to acquire a first pressing of Dave Brubeck's Time Out, still sealed in the packaging. I'll show you it here. So I mean, and the cover itself was beautiful. This is it right here. It was labeled as a 61 repress, but every indication I have is that this is actually a first press. It had this bag on the inside, which was still sealed. I actually ripped it open, so pretty awesome. And as you would expect, if you know anything about early Columbia stuff, it is a 6i, and it's a stereo. No CBS labeling of any kind on this at all. And I was very surprised about the price. And I think in general, I did a little bit of research, and in general, this album is pretty affordable in jazz standards, as jazz standards go, that is. I mean, it's one of the most popular albums of all times in jazz. Probably not that far off from Kind of Blue by Miles Davis, and yet it doesn't go for anywhere near as much as an early pressing. Doesn't seem to go for anywhere near as much as a early pressing of Kind of Blue. So I was very surprised about that. So very excited to be able to pick that up. Listened to it about a week or two ago, and decided I should probably do a shootout between that one and then my 45 RPM Analogue Productions cut that was done by Bernie Grundman for Analogue Productions that pressed at QRP. So I thought it was a good time to do a shootout with those. And I've done a few of these shootouts with kind of first/early pressings of old albums to the audiophile versions, modern audiophile versions. So this is going to be just another one of those. So this time how I did it, I kind of I obviously listened to the Time Out first pressing all the way through a couple weeks ago. And while I was doing that, I was kind of thinking about what I wanted for tracks that I thought would be the most entertaining or most obvious ones to be able to pick out little nuances on. So I chose Blue Rondo at a la Turk, and then Take 5. Probably not all that too surprising. Those are probably two of my favorite tracks on the album. But so I did that. I basically A-B'd those two tracks, on the first pressing and then on the 45 RPM. When I played the first pressing, I put it down. It sounded great. It had a great wide soundstage, a pretty good depth to it, and just overall good clean sound, nice warm mid-range, good decent bass, and just overall a good clarity. The cymbals sounded really nice and natural and clean, and just overall really enjoyed the sound of it and thought it sounded great. Put on the Analogue Productions version, again cut by Bernie Grundman. One thing that I definitely noticed right off the bat, which I think you'd notice with most of these audiophile ones, is there's definitely more hiss, and I don't think it's necessarily just because it's an older master tape, but I think it's also has to do with the fact that they don't roll off the highs as much or as low, if you will, as they do on the early pressings, like first pressings when they cut those. So that was something that jumped right out at me at first, is I definitely could hear more hiss, but then what I also heard was more high end, and I also heard a little bit more deep bass, deep bass. Very similar in terms of the kind of the mid bass to, but the really deep bass was definitely more prevalent in the Analogue Productions one. Again, I think that's more of, with the first pressings there and early pressings in general, they're trying to just make sure that these things can play on all turntables and not have any issues with skips or anything like that. Where the modern audiophile pressings are trying to go for as full of a range as they can to maximize the sound quality. And they're expected to be played on modern, better turntables that have less issues with skip because of their adjustments in the cartridges and whatnot. So that was definitely what I noticed right off the bat. The one thing that was very interesting, though, kind of while I was playing the first track, was I started hearing what sounded like pops or ticks or something, but then when I listened a lot closer, I noticed it was bass slaps, and the hi-hat was a little more prevalent, which I was kind of surprised about. When I put back the first pressing, it was definitely a situation where those were not as obvious. You could hear them, but you really had to listen for them, where they were really more obviously there on the 45 RPM audiophile pressing. So, that was definitely something that struck me and was pretty obvious to me right off the bat with the Analogue Productions one. Also, both of them you can definitely get a sense of the space that it was recorded in, with the echo and reverb and kind of the bleed over on the mics in the, like let's say the piano occasionally would pick up the snare or the hi-hat, or not hi-hat, but the ride cymbal sometimes, and things on that nature. So you could definitely hear that on both. But what was really obvious to me on the Analogue Productions is you had a greater sense of that space. I mean, you definitely felt more like you were there in the studio that they were recording it in. You could get that reverb and the echo. That presence was really much more obvious on the Analogue Productions. And I think that just has to go back to more of, being able to get more of the high-end frequencies in there, and maybe even the low-end frequencies as well, too, because that presence was definitely more obvious on the Analogue Productions one. One other thing that I noticed, too, is there's definitely, in Time Out, the track, there's definitely a tape splice, probably, I don't know, a third of the way through or so, and it's definitely obvious on both, but it's really obvious on the Analogue Productions one. So I thought that was interesting. And the other thing that was kind of odd to me, and I don't know why this is, but it definitely seemed like the horned instruments and the bass guitar too were a little bit off center on the first pressing, maybe a little bit more left, where on the Analogue Productions one it was definitely more centered. Not sure why that was. I don't know if it's my setup, but I don't think so, because I think it's just maybe the way the album was cut and off of that master. But yeah, it was definitely not centered, which I thought was kind of odd. Everything else seemed pretty similar, though. The hi-hat and snare were definitely more prevalent out on the left side. Also, on the one other thing that I would make note is on the first pressing, there's definitely that mid-range bump, if you will, or kind of that tubey feel to it, which would come from because they mostly probably used tubes to create this album from start to finish, and you definitely felt that. And it seems like there may have been a little tiny bit more dynamic compression on it, just to get a little bit more snap out of the snare drum, but that was pretty minor. But overall, it was you could definitely hear the differences between the both, and it's just a question then of what your preferences are in sound. I mean, if you really are into that old school tube sound and the little bit less high-end range to the cut and the pressing, you're definitely going to want to stick to the first pressing. But, I think overall, if you're an audiophile and you appreciate kind of getting that feeling for the room and giving that better feeling of the room, you definitely want the 45 RPM Analogue Productions. I don't have the 33 RPM, so I can't really compare those two between the 45 and 33 on the Analogue Productions, but there's definitely a big difference in sound between this first pressing and the Analogue Productions, and it's just a question of your tastes. You're going to get a little bit more high frequency, a little bit more of the really deep bass, just a little bit more, and then just a overall more of a sense of the space and the room on the Analogue Productions, where on the first pressing you're going to get more of that tubey goodness feel, if you will, for lack of a better term. That, you know, the mid-range is kind of, it's probably a little bit better on this, and the drum is a little bit snappier. So, you know, as always, all the great pressings of albums are, and that are well recorded, there's I've never found there, I've rarely found there to be a true clear-cut winner. There's usually things I like about all the different good quality pressings that are out there, and that's definitely the case here. I definitely feel that the first pressing has its merits. You know, it's obviously from the it's all obviously taken earlier. It was cut early on from fresh tapes, so you've got that advantage, obviously. And there's some obvious notations of that on the Analogue Productions. You could tell that, you know, the tapes are a little bit old on the Analogue Productions, but it doesn't take away from how it sounds overall. But you know, the first / early pressings are definitely going to give you a little bit more mid-range warmth and less of the ultra high end, and less of the ultra low end, and maybe a little bit more of a snap to the snare drum. So if you like all those things in comparison to the higher highs, lower lows, and just the better overall presence of the room, then, you know, the first pressing's for you. You know, if you're wanting that overall experience, I think that they did a great job on the Analogue Productions one here, and Bernie did a good job. You know, I guess there could be those detractors out there that say maybe if you cut down a little bit more on the high end, it would be good, because you would get rid of a little bit more of that hiss, and then it wouldn't be quite as bright like some people tend to not like. So, but again, it all is a question of your preferences. Both are great. I have a preference to the Analogue Productions one, but there's definitely a sweet spot in my heart for the first pressing, because it's got that sound of a classic late 50s, early 60s cut record. So, and it's a fresher copy of the tape that they took it from. So, you know, there's something to be said for that. But either way, you can't go wrong with either one of them. I think the 45 RPM is still available. I think the 33 might still be available from Analogue Productions. I haven't checked recently, so I apologize, I haven't done that. But at the same time, if you can find one in the kind of condition I did, they're still pretty affordable. Matter of fact, you could probably find a first pressing in really good shape that's going to sell for about the same or less than the 45 RPM. So it's not going to be a price issue. It's just going to be a question of whether you can find one in really, really good quality, in good condition, I should say. And mine obviously was flawless because it was taken fresh out of the bag, and I did the ultrasonic cleaning and listened to it, and yeah, it sounded spectacular. So very little surface noise, just really good. So that's my take. I'd love to hear your take. Do you have an early or first pressing timeout? And do you have the Analogue Productions versions, whether it's the 33 or 45? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, and maybe even if you have thoughts on a better version besides the mono, because I mean, obviously there's arguments for the mono, but I would really love to hear what you have to say about what your feelings are about what version of the stereo timeout is your favorite, and get your take on that, and love to hear your feedback. So hit that like button if you like the video. Subscribe to my channel, I'd appreciate it. Hit that alert bell, let you know when my new videos come out. Check out my social media pages. I've got them listed in the description in this video. And that is everything for this week. Thank you very much, and you have a great one.